Hi, everybody. Thank you again for tuning into the Policing in America podcast. I'm your host, Sergeant Tom. Today, I am very excited to share with you a guest, Peter Kirsanow. He's a practicing attorney who specializes in labor and employment law. He served as a member on the National Labor Relations Board, and he's a distinguished member of the United States Commission on Civil Rights. Mr. Kirsanow, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
So I thought I would just go nice and light and ease into it and just see what you think about the idea of the false narrative around policing. You've talked about this a lot. Would you mind just giving a little bit of a synopsis on your perspective or view of this false narrative?
Yeah, the false narrative, and this is based on empirical data that we've got that we adduced at the Civil Rights Commission that doesn't get, unfortunately, a whole lot of play. The false narrative is one that was on vivid display during the George Floyd debacle and everything that related from that. You saw it in the media, you saw it from academia, we saw it from activists who claimed that blacks are being disproportionately hunted down and shot by cops. Blacks are disproportionately arrested and are the subject of disparate treatment generally with respect to law enforcement. And the facts don't bear that out. In fact, the facts show that if anyone suffers adversely, at least based on proportional representation and involvement in crime, it would not be blacks, but it probably would be whites by a far greater measure. The reason for the false narrative is it is true that blacks are arrested more often, blacks are convicted more often for a variety of crimes than are whites or Asians or even Hispanics, who also have a relatively higher rate of offense than do whites and Asians. But that doesn't take into consideration black involvement in crime. When you take into consideration, for example, the false narrative with respect to blacks being disproportionately shot by cops or disproportionately abused by cops. You saw that, again, with George Floyd. Almost every network commentator claimed that, or just simply assumed, that blacks were preyed upon by cops, were treated differently in terms of arrests and shootings and abuse. When you take a look at the data, law enforcement, regardless of their white, black, or anything else in between, do not confront individuals readily unless they've been involved in some kind of incident or crime. There's a reason for that. And when you take into consideration black involvement in crime, it's unfortunate, but blacks are far more likely to be involved in the kinds of crimes that may result in a police officer pulling a service revolver. That is, where someone's trying to escape because they've committed some type of felony, such as murder, robbery, aggravated assault, rape, and they may be confronting, meaning the police may be confronting these individuals in a situation that's volatile. It's a situation that may produce violence of some sort, whether it be physical violence or firearm violence. And very often, the suspect is also armed. So when you take in consideration the factors, that is, compare apples to apples, it turns out that blacks are actually less likely to be involved in police shootings than black involvement in crime would suggest. So this false narrative, unfortunately, has been seized upon, and it's used almost as a justification. If you listen to many news commentators, especially the more irresponsible ones, they will almost give support to the notion that, well, because blacks are targeted or abused by cops, there's a justification for blacks to respond in a violent manner or to be engaged in riots or protests that we saw after George Floyd. And that's not good for anybody in society and perpetuates, I think, racial divides much more readily than if we could just seize upon and focus on what the true facts are.
And sir, it's not, we make these, what would you call them, empirical statements, and it's not that we're saying there aren't problems. There are problems, and those problems are a little bit more micro. You have specific instances that are troubling, but when it is spread out among the entire populace of policing, which it seems to be. Do you know why, or would you venture a guess as to why, say, when a doctor is caught on video poisoning bags, IV bags, and this was captured fairly recently, the doctor was was caught doing this. He was putting poison, an idea that people were going to die from this. It didn't get nearly the outrage that one officer could maybe be involved in a fatal incident. And maybe it's questionable. It merits investigation, but that could just throw everyone into a very emotionally heated response.
Right. I think there are a number of factors. Let me just pose one. And that is that when it comes to policing, there is a political component that can't be avoided. Mm-hmm. Police are subject to governance by either a state or local mayor or council or governor. And as a result, there's that oversight. Also, police are going to be involved in more visible occasions where some type of misconduct has occurred. Whereas a doctor, he doesn't have a camera on him. He doesn't have a body cam. And it's less likely that we're going to see that. It's less likely it's going to make the news. Now, you may hear of some of the more egregious cases. Somebody goes into a nursing home and pulls the plug on 7 or 8 people. You're going to hear about those kinds of things because law enforcement's involved. So I think because of the visible nature, but also never forget, and it's unfortunate that we have to raise this, but it happens. There's a political imperative. That is, politicians, for better or worse, and I think it's important that politicians look at any kind of police misconduct or any kind of government employee misconduct and address it. That's what their function is. But there's a subset of politician that uses high-profile cases of police misconduct for political imperatives that are personal. That is, they could advance their own political prospects within a party, or there's also actors who have a certain interest that are not politicians, but they've got movement interests. They think that a certain narrative, true or false, perpetuates or furthers a political narrative that they're trying to drive. And then, there's an emotional one too. I think a lot of people are looking for excuses. Mm-hmm. They look for excuses for a lot of maladies that plague society. And if you see somebody being shot by a cop, that feeds into or could feed into an historical narrative that, blacks are disproportionately abused by cops and by government in general. And unfortunately, I think that's one of the things, or several of the things actually, that drives this.
It's fair. Thank you for that. So with the idea of the narrative, and there are kernels of truth throughout all these things. There is historical injustices, and there are bad actors. You talk about this in a country of 300 million people. You're going to have some bad actors. What comes from this are policies, and I think that's where it starts to get a little bit nefarious for the public at large, and we might be seeing some of this. So correct me if I'm wrong. The idea around the systemic problems in the law enforcement chain, would you say, is that there's systemic problems. So one of them would be bail. And so one of the policies that came out of that was bail reform, because bail in general disproportionately impacts people. And that's a correlation. There's other nuances to it, right? So now we have this zero bail or no bail whatsoever, or very low bail. And what we see from my perspective is people are getting in a revolving door. We're making arrests. Officers are making arrests, but those individuals are being put right back out because of zero bail. Are you seeing that also, or do you notice that?
And it's significant. Yeah, you can argue that maybe bail does disproportionately impact the impecunious. No doubt about it. If you've got to post a certain amount of bail, a billionaire is going to be able to post it much more readily, even with the proportional setting of bail, than somebody who is poor. There's no doubt about that. And maybe things can be done to remedy that, but no cash bail or anything of that nature is one of the dumbest things imaginable and dangerous things imaginable. And we're seeing the consequences right now being played out in real time in those jurisdictions where you've got this. And I understand Chicago's about to embark on this. A little over a year and a half ago, the Civil Rights Commission did a comprehensive study on bail reform. We issued a report at the beginning of this year. And I wrote a dissenting statement to that report because the data bears out that, first of all, the consequences of not having some kind of bail we're seeing in real time. That is, more people are more likely to abscond because bail is an anchor. Bail is used to make sure somebody reappears for a court date. But that's not the only reason, although many will suggest that should be the only reason. Everyone understands one of the reasons is because when you see individuals, I think of the individual who was wielding a hatchet in New York City at a McDonald's. Query, by the way, in New York City, who carries a hatchet around? I mean,
Yes.
I mean, this is not Davy Crockett time. But nonetheless, you saw that individual assaulting people, and then within less than 24 hours, he's out on the street. This is somebody who's a menace to society. He's dangerous. And another reason for bail is to not just to simply make sure they appear for whatever court date they may have, but also incapacitation. That means they're not able to commit further crimes while out awaiting trial and maybe sentencing and incarceration. I don't have the data in front of me, but if you take a look at my statements and a lot of other statements out there in the bail reform report, you'll see that an offender who is out on bail is extremely likely to commit another crime. There's going to be a significant amount of recidivism. And those crimes aren't minor crimes necessarily. Look at all the folks who've been out on bail recently, the high-profile cases. The individual in Waukesha, Wisconsin, was out on bail at the time that he mowed down 6 people. That was more spectacular than most, but it's not uncommon. You see people out on bail regularly committing crime because, as you know very well, a tiny percentage of the American population commits the overwhelming percentage of crimes. You've got people who are repeat offenders and recidivists who are responsible for most of the crimes committed in the country. So when someone's out on bail, it's more likely than not that somebody probably committed crimes in the past. They're going to commit crimes in the future. And another aspect of this is witness intimidation. One of the things that we heard from, I don't recall exactly, I don't know if it was Commissioner Bratton or someone, New York City police force, who was saying that the individuals out on crime or out on bail are far more likely to approach those who may have been potential witnesses in a court case and threaten them or their families. I mean, I live in Cleveland in a fairly high crime area. I've got a nice piece of property, but I live in a pretty tough area, and it is not uncommon. You see it all the time. It's not uncommon for somebody who is awaiting trial or even sentencing to intimidate those who may have been witnesses. So there are a lot of reasons why you have bail. Can it be tweaked and reformed? Yes, but this wholesale abandonment of the bail system, I think, is one of the dumbest and looniest ideas that I've come across in some time. And that's saying something.
Absolutely it is. Sir, so the idea, we say false narrative, this is being generated by a media machine. And is it possible that the media machine, for lack of a better term coming to my mind, is pushing this for viewership because it wants to feed what people are going to watch? Is it possible that because there's what is the phrase is, just because there's an increase of coverage doesn't mean there's an increase in actual events? The shootings of people have been pretty consistent. We see this with the Washington Post fatal. They track all this and fatal police shootings,
Right.
And it's pretty consistent ever since 2015, despite all the interventions. An intervention being bias training, body-worn cameras, 8 can't wait, all these different policy enactments, and yet you don't move the needle. And they talk about this like probability theory because you're dealing with very large number sets. 50 million people arrested every year for various crimes. Right. Probably some 200 million contacts. And you're talking about 1,000 fatal instances, sometimes 980, sometimes 1,100, but in general, about 1,000. But it's hard to get people to understand that. How are you supposed to make an improvement? If I cut that number in half, my data is still going to be the same. It's still going to be 0.001%. And it's very difficult to make something even better when these anomalies are happening, because they are in fact anomalies.
Yeah. The death of any person obviously is a tragedy, so it's going to loom large. We have a nation of, I think going on 340 million people. And when you look at the Washington Post data set with respect to police shootings, of unarmed individuals. And remember, unarmed doesn't necessarily mean that those individuals don't pose a threat. They may have, for example, a firearm on the seat next to them, or they may have just thrown away a firearm. There's all kinds of instances. And I don't mean to diminish it, but when you're talking about 340 million people, we're looking at in any given year, I think it's 26 unarmed shootings.
Right.
Out of who knows how many encounters, because we don't know precisely how many encounters there may be, because there's a certain definition for encounters. There could be situations that may prompt some type of response that don't qualify as an encounter. And also, not every police jurisdiction defines it the same way. But putting that all aside, we're talking about, and again, every single shooting and especially every death is a tragedy. But my goodness, I'm a lawyer. I sit in an air-conditioned office. I get the benefit of, when somebody asks me a question, of thinking about it, deliberating about it. I'm not doing it under any given stress. I've got a nice air-conditioned office. I'm looking out at Cleveland Stadium right now. That's stressful because we never win. But nonetheless, I have the ability to make a cool, calm, and a reasoned judgment, whereas somebody who's looking down the barrel of a gun aimed at him by a suspected perpetrator has got to make a snap decision. Given all of that, again, not to diminish it, but it is almost incomprehensible. It almost defies belief that we have that few fatal encounters, given the number of interactions. Again, not to diminish it, but I think to your point of there seems to be a great amount of attention being accorded this. And it should be, because if we could bring it down to zero, that would be great. It's never going to happen statistically, but that's the aim. However, I think most people who've been on this earth for more than 30 seconds recognize there's a political imperative that drives a lot of this. You see certain actors in politics seize upon any instance of police misconduct to drive an agenda. And it's not necessarily an agenda that's going to help their constituents. It's an agenda that's going to either help, and I don't mean to disparage every politician, but there's a certain number of politicians that are driving a political narrative for their own benefit or the benefit of their party or their ideology. But when you look at the numbers don't bear out that there's some kind of, I don't remember what the phrase that was used popularly after George Floyd, but the cops are hunting blacks down. Absolutely not the case. Whites are proportionally more likely to be shot, up to twice as likely to be shot than blacks are. And given an apples to apples comparison. And the other thing about it is it's not being driven by any form of police racism or bias, because black cops are 3.3 times more likely to pull their service revolver than a white cop when a black suspect is being apprehended. And the reason for that makes sense, at least it does to me, because I know how I would react under a certain circumstance, or any human being would. And that is, a white cop is petrified of pulling a service revolver because he's seen what's happened to, in the George Floyd instance, the Michael Brown instance, the Freddie Gray instance. You know what happens to those cops. Some of those cops disappear, don't even know where they are anymore. Maybe they're out of the country. You don't want to be in that circumstance. So they're hesitant, and that's not good, because that puts them and their partners in jeopardy.
Yeah, when you have the officer in Ferguson who was absolved of any wrongdoing by the DOJ, like that came down in the little Ferguson and all the might and power of the U.S. DOJ to find no wrongdoing, and that he could never be an officer there again.
Right.
I have no idea what happened to Officer Darren Wilson.
He may have left the country.
No, absolutely. And though he was shown when there was every incentive to find wrongdoing, because that sparked a ridiculous amount of anarchy and whatnot, there was every incentive to find wrongdoing. So even controlling for a person's innate and implicit bias, nothing could be found. Now, the system at Ferguson, the police department, was found to have some issues and whatnot, but the individual. Go ahead, sir.
Understand those issues too, because we took a look at that. The DOJ came out, Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice went out and looked at disproportional enforcement of the law, and said, well, there are more traffic stops and more this, that, and the other thing. Those were relatively minor crimes, but more importantly, again, comparing apples to apples, when you took a look at the rate of offense and the number of, say, traffic stops or the number of arrests for so-called minor offenses, There was no true disparity on the basis of race at all. But what gets reported are raw numbers that blacks are more likely to be arrested. And unfortunately, what happens, because this is a real societal problem, we want to make sure that there's equal enforcement of the law, that there's no racial bias in it. At the same time, we have to make sure that we're not jeopardizing the lives of the public or the law enforcement officers. And what's happening is, I think we are, to some extent, the narrative that we find from some people who are interested political actors, as well as many in the media, to try to gin up, I guess, some kind of controversy or maybe, newspaper sales, whatever it may be, they don't compare apples to apples. And when you don't compare apples to apples, it drives this false narrative, and it doesn't help society. I would guess, I don't know this, we didn't do an analysis, but again, I live in inner city Cleveland. All my neighbors are black. I would be fairly certain that if you walked into the average black neighborhood and took a poll, most people there would unequivocally say blacks are being preyed upon by cops and they're 3, 4, or 5 times more likely to be arrested, when the data don't bear that out.
And it's a fascinating phenomena that if you step back and you try to be analytical, pragmatic, and intellectually honest, I have family members who think it's happening. I have people that say, well, you're one of the good ones. I'm looking at one right now. It's called the Western Journal. There was a survey, 44% of liberals think cops kill around 1,000 unarmed black men a year. Like it's being pushed so much that when you tell people how the numbers are so small, they can't get their mind around it, because now I have to compete with, the phenomena of like the anchoring effect and the fact that they're wrong about how they look at something and their worldview is being challenged.
Right.
And it is a monstrosity to overcome. So what we end up doing is saying, okay, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to put body-worn cameras on everybody. We're going to decriminalize narcotics. And then if we decriminalize narcotics, there's a large study came out, and I forget it was in Colorado. There's still a disparity among races, even though the narcotics have been decriminalized, because the only time you can make arrests now are for sales. So just personal use is no longer a thing. Well, it turns out that for sales is being done by a particular cohort, and that's not supporting the idea that if we just decriminalize it, all these racial disparities will go away. And I don't know how to have intellectual conversations anymore with people to say, let's come up with good ideas on how to make this better, because it all seems to come down to race.
Yeah, and people are invested in previously held assumptions. I know I am. It's human nature. You don't want to be proven wrong, especially if it's something you've held for a long period of time and then you find out that it's wrong. Look, I am a man of a certain age. I'm pretty old myself. And I've been on the Civil Rights Commission for more than 20 years. Even though I've always been, a pretty big supporter of cops. I probably, if you would have asked me this question maybe 20 years ago, I would have said, yeah, I think that blacks are more likely to be shot by cops, apples to apples comparison. Mm-hmm. And then I looked at more data, and then we had a hearing at the Civil Rights Commission. We got FBI Uniform Crime Report statistics, and Heather McDonald, for example, has done yeoman's work on this, conducting analyses, and there have been others too. And the fact of the matter is, the assumption is incorrect. It's a nice and comfortable narrative that a lot of people like to perpetuate, but it is false. And the reason why I think a lot of us need to call it out is because it is harmful to society, it exacerbates racial division, and it's dangerous. Because if you can see it. I remember maybe it was last spring, I was driving home, and there were 2 cop cars who had stopped somebody. Black guy was outside, and he was acting as if he wanted to be shot. I mean, he was doing all the wrong things. Everyone tells you when confronted by a cop, you follow their directions, don't do anything confrontational, no rapid movements, any of that stuff. The old Chris Rock video, for example. This guy was just acting as if, he was being beset by injustice all of his life, and this was the straw that broke the camel's back. And I think I would act like that too if I had a firmly held belief that I'm being singled out on the basis of some immutable characteristic like race. So I think it's very important for society that we get this right. And then people can make their judgments. If you still want to think that, blacks are being disproportionately harmed by cops, okay, we're not going to be able to dissuade you from that. But at least public policy should not be based on false narratives.
So two things on this. And one, I wanted to share with you a quick story because I find it a little humorous. So white male grown up in inner city Chicago. When I got my driver's license, my grandmother took a paper clip and she put the paper clip on my driver's license and she folded, back then, a decent amount of money, a $20 bill, and she tucked it in. And she said, if you ever get pulled by the police, you hand them the license and then they will hand it back to you without that $20. And hopefully you'll just go on your way. And I say this because that was common belief. Because I will often hear, well, I have to give my kids the talk about police because my kids look a certain way. Here I am, blonde hair, blue-eyed little white kid. You'd think I'd be able to just do whatever I want. But even my own grandmother was worried about everybody gets the talk. You don't talk back to the police. You act professional. You don't say you didn't do it. You just keep your mouth shut and you just get through the incident. So I always found that to be a little interesting because people think only one particular family has this conversation.
I don't know of anybody who doesn't get the talk, and it's just a matter of survival because, it's a good idea to maybe follow the instructions of somebody who's carrying a weapon,
Exactly. It's common sense. Now, on that, we're both fans of Heather McDonald, and I've watched her work and read her work. She was on a show once, and it was called Intelligence Squared, and they were debating this. And this is a common response to crime and policing and overrepresentation. More cops police neighborhoods of color. Therefore, you're going to find more crime. So it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. The guest on the show Law Day made this point to you, and I think he tried to call it the Heisenberg principle. And he said, you're going to find what you're looking for. And if we just flooded the Pacific Palisades or Malibu with cops, we would see the same numbers in policing. It's only because we have so many cops in this area that crime is high. What is your response to that?
I can't do any better than Willie Sutton did. When they asked him, why do you rob banks? He says, that's where the money is. Unfortunately, one of the reasons, probably the basic reason why you'll find more policing in black neighborhoods is that's where the crime is. Again, I live in black inner city Cleveland. Most of my neighbors are either retired, employed, maybe have their own small business like next door landscaping service. We have community meetings from time to time. I hardly ever attend anymore, but my wife would go. And if you go to them, you will never, ever, ever, ever hear somebody say, we need fewer cops. They're always asking for, even begging for. I remember going down to City Hall one year with a group of my neighbors asking for more police protection. They want more cops. Now, what you will find is the squeaky wheel gets the grease or gets the oil. You're going to find activists. Where is the money and where's the attention? The money and attention isn't in being sedate, being sober, being quiet. The money and attention is if you can shake your fist and say, things are awful, things are bad, we need this, that, and the other thing. It's the, I don't want to mention any names, but, well-known media personalities who are out there always rabble-rousing. You can be, rabble-rousing for fun and profit. But if you talk to ordinary civilians on the ground in these neighborhoods, I don't know if anybody says we need fewer cops. They want more protection. They get it. So these media folks, I don't want to paint a broad brush, but there's some media folks who parachute into black neighborhoods when there's some kind of, incident that occurs, and they focus on it, and then they leave, and they draw a broad-based conclusion from one incident and report about it. And then people who don't live in that neighborhood think, well, everybody in that neighborhood either doesn't want the cops or think they're being besieged by the cops. False. I'm not going to speak for all of my neighbors. All I know is the ones who attend these community meetings, the ones that I talk to, they want more cops, not fewer cops. And I guarantee if you go to almost any other black neighborhood with responsible individuals, not people who are committing the crimes and not people who are relatives who have an interest of those who are committing the crimes, they're going to say, give us more cops. That's where the crime is occurring, or a large or disproportionate amount of the crime is occurring. Those people want protection. They're not idiots.
Fair. Sir, let me pose this to you just to see another side of this. if the data on police killing is it's a false narrative idea. We're relative to the larger number, it's lightning strike events. They are very, very rare. The
By the
other
way,
side,
that's a pretty good analogy. Let's get back to it. Remind me to get back to that with respect to lightning strikes, because I did a little arithmetic on that, and you'd be amazed by this.
Okay, thank you. But what I try to tell my officers too, because I'm trying to solve the problem on both sides, my officers are also not being hunted, because we will see an over reporting of an officer being shot, an officer being killed. And when you have 800,000 of us, and it's a dangerous job, there's going to be times when officers get hurt. Traffic collisions tends to be the first. COVID is taking the lives. Suicide takes a lot of our lives. And then, of course, there are attacks on police officers. And we do see an uptick in this. Mm-hmm. So I'm not trying to belittle it. But is it also fair to say that even some on the other, on the thin blue line side are being a little bit misled of the danger of the job? Not to say it's not dangerous, just to say not everybody's trying to kill you.
Yeah, I don't know that. I mean, years ago, I'm a lawyer, as you just indicated, and I'd represented, among others, the city of Cleveland with respect to cops. Got to know a lot of cops in the process of this. Not being a cop, I don't know what drives the mentality, to answer your question. But I do think that the atmosphere, at least since George Floyd, and even predating that, going back Michael Brown and maybe even before that, sure. But the atmosphere is one where if you're someone who is looking to make a career of anything, why would you go into the most dangerous career outside of being in the military, get relatively low pay, and then be the subject of public opprobrium on top of it, which public opprobrium has been increasing over the last few years? You're being disrespected. You're not being paid a whole lot. In fact, they're defunding you to the tunes in any given major metropolitan area to the tune of tens of millions of dollars. Don't have the equipment or support to perform your job. Why? Why do that? And I think that may be one of the driving features. I know that there are a number of municipalities, we looked at this briefly, but there are a number of municipalities that have been having difficulty reaching their recruitment goals. Every day that I come to my office, there's a billboard outside of our building here, urging people to join the police force in a way that I hadn't seen. I've been living in Cleveland all my life, pretty much, outside of being in Washington, D.C., take certain positions. But I haven't seen that kind of almost, I won't say desperation, but the urgency in recruiting cops.
Sure.
We're at a real crisis point here, and I don't think that's overstating it, where we've had we've had thousands of retirements or people just outright quitting because they're being vilified. They're being talked about being hunted. You've got prosecutors out here who are letting people like the hatchet-wielding guy in McDonald's go the next day. But boy, if a cop looks at somebody the wrong way, they're going to come after them with everything they've got. It's a difficult and tough environment to be a cop today. And I think that, that kind of story is out there. Again, I don't speak for everybody, but I was at an event, speaking at an event a little over a week ago. And we were talking about all manner of social issues at this event. It was a radio network talkers tour. And afterwards, I spoke with a number of officers, a number of them, who came up to me and mentioned the difficulties they've been having, the ones I've just alluded to, but also the pride that I would suspect that cops had 30, 40 years ago in being a cop has been diminished considerably because the people who should be having their back are treating them as villains. And when you have that kind of dynamic, again, I haven't looked at this specifically. This is just off the top of my head. But again, since I've been around for nearly 7 decades, I have a little bit amount of common sense. I would suspect that makes it more difficult to get the good guys, to recruit the good guys to be cops. Not to say you're getting bad guys, but you're not getting necessarily the kind of guys you would have gotten before, at least as many of them that you would have gotten before. And I also know that a number of municipal departments are having a difficulty in securing recruits. So anyway, I hope that answers your question.
It does, sir. No, I appreciate your perspective on it. Please tell me about your lightning strike event.
Yeah, it's not a lightning strike event, but we did, after the Jussie Smollett incident, I took a look at some of the numbers because, again, Jussie Smollett was the subject supposedly of a hate crime. And I looked at a number of regnant theories with respect to hate crimes and police misconduct. With respect to, I'll be brief, and I don't have the exact numbers, but this is pretty much in the ballpark. When you take a look at hate crimes, for example, you are almost identical. The odds of being struck by lightning and being the victim of a violent hate crime are identical. The proverbial lightning strike. Okay.
Yeah.
So you devote a lot of time to hate crimes for something that is horrific. We don't want any kind of a hate crime, but by the same token, it's extraordinarily rare. And it's not at the level that has been built up by certain political activists and the media, but I repeat myself sometimes. Something similar with respect to cops shooting any kind of suspect, but particularly black suspects. Given the number of police encounters or number of police encounters with black suspects, and you take a look at the overall instances where someone would be compelled to pull a service revolver because there's a threat of imminent bodily harm, the odds of being shot by a cop are extraordinarily low. Maybe not at the lightning strike level, but still, it's one of these things that is an anomaly. Again, when it happens, it's horrific, and it should make the news. But I think what's happened is we've gotten into, as I said, the false narrative that this is happening with frequency, some type of incidents occurring almost on a daily basis. That is not the case. Do we want to still lower it? Yes. But we also want to lower the rhetoric, the volume of the rhetoric, the heat of the rhetoric, because I think it's hurting public policy or how we fashion public policy. Just witness bail reform. One of the dumbest things imaginable, but we instituted it in large part as a result or a reaction to what we thought was the unjustified shootings of black and unprecedented numbers of black suspects. So we come up with these ideas. Someone's always searching for what they perceive to be a solution. In this case, it's a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me just get your take on this. I want good policing, and I want to make the life better for officers, because my belief is if my officers are prepared, they're going to better serve and protect the public. So if we're going to call ourselves a profession, one of the big issues I have is the trucking, rail car, airline, shipping industry, even the medical community have minimums when it comes to sleep. And law enforcement, and Harvard has studies, and Professor Lois James out of Washington is doing incredible work on this. Police officers, to the tune of about 50% on any given day, are chronically sleep deprived right now. So right now in the US, 50% of our cops are operating on less than optimal sleep, which you and I don't have to be neuroscientists to know what happens when you're not sleeping. Just the simple cognitive impairment, let alone impatience and inability to process executive function and whatnot, that never seems to get talked about. If there is a bad incident and a cop has, mistakes a cell phone for a gun, it's right away the race. And the first thing I will sometimes ask is, I wonder how long that cop's been awake. I wonder how many days, is this 3 of 3 for that cop, 4 of 4? In Chicago, is it day 17 as they cancel their days off and they just work back to back to back? It seems like if we're going to call ourselves a profession, let's not reform it, let's improve it, and let's put some of these policies in. Have you ever come across any of the data or have any opinion on the sleep deprivation crisis that's in policing?
No, not directly. I haven't done a deep dive into it, but we had, I'm trying to remember which briefing this was. Again, I've been on commission for a long time, but we've had briefings that are on the periphery of that. It's escaping. We had one that analyzed certain data out of Florida, and forgive me, I wasn't thinking
okay,
about
sure.
this, but let me just simply say it makes sense that you just mentioned a few occupations that are, there are occupations that can have big downsides if somebody makes a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
If cops make a mistake, it's often fatal. If an airline pilot makes a mistake, it's bad news. If a surgeon makes a mistake, it's bad news. And as you indicated, there are standards associated with all these professions, both in terms of the amount of training they get and retesting that they get, and also the parameters that are placed around physical issues related to the performance of their jobs. They're supposed to get a certain amount of sleep. They have to have a certain amount of time off and all that. And I think that when you're talking about cops, you have to be cognizant of the fact that they may be subjected to extremely high pressure circumstances that require snap judgments, and you want that to happen when someone has a clear mind, enough rest so they can process information adequately and make the best judgment possible. Personally, I don't know that I would come up with a universal national standard. I'm more in favor of having it done at bare minimum at maximum by a state standard, or more importantly, a locality. Localities are best suited knowing the circumstances an individual officer is going to confront, and that a New York City police officer is going to be confronted with many of the same circumstances as, say, someone from Waukesha, Wisconsin, but also maybe a little bit different too. Especially smaller communities versus larger communities, so-called diverse communities versus communities that may be, predominantly of one race or ethnicity. Those kinds of things that can be taken into consideration so that you can formulate standards that cops have got to meet, and thereby lower the probability of mistakes being made, the cops being hurt themselves. Again, I look at the airline standards that they have. You want to make sure that you have individuals with high profile, high risk jobs having the maximum amount of protection, and that they're operating at a high capacity.
Yeah, I agree, sir. And it just seems like we don't have a lot of, airlines, one of the safest industries that are out there, but it wasn't at one time. And we put interventions in to ensure that we created a safer environment. And I see a lot of interventions in policing. I see a lot of training. Doesn't necessarily mean it's effective. Sometimes it's like a mill. Just everyone sit through implicit bias. Okay, we're now all implicitly bias trained. But did you learn anything? Did you actually walk away with something? So,
and by the way, implicit bias is not what it's made out to be. We could talk about that for an hour. Also, I tell you, the amount of the new term now is disinformation and misinformation. Well, the amount of misinformation on this issue is extraordinary. And going to that issue, you take a look at implicit bias with respect to making certain assessments. Is a police officer more likely to pull his service revolver if he sees a black face, white face? There's so much, let me put it this way, there's too much inconclusive information out there to formulate any judgment. Is it possible? Maybe it's possible, but these individuals who are rushing out there saying that officers are acting based on an implicit bias don't have the appropriate data set, and they're making leaps in logic. And given the importance, given the consequences of coming up with solutions or standards related to police conduct, you better make sure you got this down pretty well, okay? Don't make certain assumptions, because it can go both ways. We're putting officers and those that he's designed or he is obligated to protect at risk too. I may be going off on a tangent, but what comes to my mind immediately is about a year ago, there was an officer in Columbus, Ohio, who shot a female assailant. She was, assailing she was a black female. She was assailing another black female. And people were saying, why didn't he just shoot the knife out of her hand? As if he's Dirty Harry or something.
Right.
I mean, it's these kinds of things that, again, when you have these false narratives and you've got this half-baked approach to standards and don't understand what's involved here. And I don't purport to be an expert on this. I just, we just have a few studies. But as the great American philosopher Dirty Harry Callahan said in Magnum Force, a man's got to know his limitations, and researchers do too.
You talked about that in Ohio, and I believe that was one of the ones that set off LeBron James, I believe. And, you got somebody with an incredible reach, 200 million people on the Twitter, and to say, stop killing us. And here's a person, like you said, in a snap judgment, had to make this decision to save a life. And they'll say, well, she's only 16. It's very hard for me to tell somebody's age when they have a knife and they're about to, shank or stab somebody. Number two, I did watch the media because I was very curious about this because the podcast was up and running. So I wanted to see how they would look at it. And people said, it's just a knife. And I thought, my goodness, like to try to minimize that. Well,
Right.
it's just a knife. This is how it is. This is how disputes get resolved sometimes in the inner city. But that's not a healthy environment
Right.
then. And that's not a logical way to look at this.
Yeah.
That was to watch that unfold and to see the political divide on that, because it was a clearly the officer acted within the policies, within reasonableness and logic. It was very, very clearly there.
All due
But
respect to LeBron James, if he had to make a three-pointer with 1 second left in the seventh game of the NBA Finals, and at that time he knew somebody was pointing a gun at him, I'd like to see how he'd react under those circumstances.
it's a very fair point. Um, Sir, what do you think about the idea of the civilian oversight boards in policing? A lot of them already have it. Some of the larger agencies have it, and some of the smaller agencies are going to it. And what I hear back is, well, these aren't cops. I don't want a cop judging me, or I don't want a cop telling me what to do. But we have civilian oversight in the U.S. government. It seems like the president's in charge of the military and whatnot. Do you have a take on that at all?
Yeah, I do. And it's informed in some part by, my own experience. Again, I'd represented the city of Cleveland on these types of matters. And I hate to give wishy-washy answers to anything, but it depends. Okay.
Sure.
My experience and my observation of these boards is that if I were to, somebody say, are they 50% good and 50% bad? I'd say that a lot of them are not worth the panels that a lot of them do more harm than good. Not all of them. I do think without question there needs to be oversight, but that's why we have elected representatives. That's why we have a mayor. That's why he has a safety director, so on and so forth. Again, I don't dismiss it, but I think we want to be careful about them, because my concern is that very often you hear the cry for the establishment of a civilian review board after some horrific shooting. And the knee-jerk response, and those that populate the civilian review board or are interested in applying for it, already have a predetermined idea about what cops are all about.
Right.
I don't know. And plus, many of the people, again, all due respect to the people who decide to serve on these boards, because they're doing something I'm not doing, they're taking their time to do it. But a lot of the people who are on these boards don't have any training in, how to, prevent a crime from occurring, a felony from occurring, assault from occurring. They have a bias. In other words, there is self-selection going on to some extent, because what you've got are people who are interested in being on a civilian review board might already have a predetermined view of what cops are all about. So again, I don't want to dismiss it, but I think you have to be very careful in constituting a civilian review board, and there should be strict guidelines surrounding it. Ultimately, I think the people that we elect as representatives, as a mayor, should be the ones involved in this. But I'm not opposed to civilian review board. But as I said, I think you need to be very careful in the level of authority that's given to them.
Sir, I know a lot of officers, myself included. We appreciate a lot of your command of the data and expressing it, and support of police in general. Do you feel as though the police leadership, so not the rank and file, but the leadership, is doing a good job nationally in maybe coming out and defending officers? I don't want to say defending, but maybe just supporting or being reasonable with how they explain things to the public.
Yeah. Again, I don't want to paint a broad brush, but I see some really good leaders out there, very good leaders. And then I see some who appear to be a little bit more political than they are in terms of being leaders of the respective forces. And that happens in almost any kind of profession, I think, especially one that, it's in almost any profession that has interaction with the government, especially if the government funds you, if the government has oversight authority over you. There's going to be a little bit of that dynamic. But policing is different from any other kind of occupation. It's different than your water pipe repairman for a municipality or for a trash hauler at a municipality. You're talking about life and death consequences, extremely serious consequences. And I think that leadership is one that doesn't sweep bad actors under the rug, but at the same time, you don't go running for the hills the minute the politicians out there and media start making a cause celeb of something before you get the facts. The biggest thing leaders can do is support your members. And this is my view, again, uninformed by anything other than what I've seen and my experience on the Civil Rights Commission, is support your members until such time as there's a reason not to support them. I think you've got to give your members the benefit of the doubt. And I think that 99.99% of cops are there to do a good job. They're people who, this isn't something they could probably just as easily have taken something that's not as risky, not as stressful, maybe even pays more, but a number of them decide to be dedicated servants of the community, have their back. And maybe that will encourage them to always do the right thing and exercise the best judgment possible.
It's nice and well thought out. It's very, very well said. Okay, I know your time is coming to a close, and I could keep you all day. So I'm going to ask two very similar questions as we come to a close. If you were hosting a town hall and you had a group of angry citizenry or angry residents who were just not liking the police, and you had an elevator pitch to them, what would you tell the public? Maybe there's some public members listening. What would you tell them as we try to bridge the gap right now?
I won't tell them anything. I think I show them videos, before and after videos. Take a look at before and after of, say, St. Louis or Chicago or Minnesota. What happened before George Floyd, as an example, and after George Floyd? You take a look at some of the burned out areas in many of these areas and what happened as a result of that. About 30 years ago or so, I traveled to Detroit, which is not far from Cleveland, on business virtually every week. Mm-hmm. And, there came a gap in that about 10 years. And I remember going back to this one area 10 years later, and it looked like Hiroshima. I mean, almost literally like Hiroshima. Wow. And some of that was the result of anti-cop, well, I don't know if it was the result, but it succeeded anti-cop rhetoric. Wow. And when police withdraw from policing, and Heather has done a great job of showing this, she calls it the Ferguson effect, but writ large, when police withdraw from policing, it has just a profoundly negative effect on communities. They stop to thrive. And the domino effect is extraordinary. I would show people videos of here's what it's like when we had some robust policing. Were there problems? Yes, but we can fix those, and we should work credibly to fix those. But to demonize an entire subset of the population because of what we perceive to be bad conduct on the part of a few, I think results in really horrific and deleterious repercussions down the road. And again, 2 years after the so-called Summer of Love, I think the mayor of Seattle put it.
Yep.
Look at Seattle. Look at what's happened to it. Look at Portland. Look at San Francisco. And it's not simply that there's more crime, but look at the general conditions. I remember before COVID, I hadn't been to San Francisco in about 4 years before. I last went there just before COVID, but I hadn't been there in about 4 years prior to that. And I remember going through the city, in the back of a cab on my way to an office, and being struck by how it deteriorated. And then other cities since then, especially after, again, I hate to use George Floyd as the only marker because there are a number of markers, but it's an easy one. You go to a number of cities, large cities throughout the country, and it looks third world. And it's not the only reason, but one of the major reasons is because we have changed how we approach law enforcement. We have done things like so-called bail reform. We have had different sentencing for criminals, so it's easier for them. We've had soft on crime policies. And again, we've turned into this kind of dysfunctional, it's dystopia. Yeah. So I would say, hold off. Let's address the discrete problems that we've got, but not shove under the bus an entire police department or entire profession.
I appreciate that. And the final one, before I let you go, sir, if you had a room full of officers who are feeling this lack of support and are thinking of leaving the profession or maybe leaving early, and they just don't have the motivation for whatever reason, the conditions, what would you say to them?
Yeah, it's easy
to
for me
keep
to
them?
say because I'm in a nice, comfortable office. I don't have to put my
Sure.
life on the line, But what I would do is exhort them to, stay the course because we need them. We need them. We need them more now than ever. And also understand, yeah, the squeaky wheel gets the oil or the grease. And you hear a lot of squeaky wheels in the media. But if you come to my neighborhood, for example, and talk to the people who aren't squeaky, but they're the people who make the community run, they want police presence. We appreciate it. We support it. And yeah, we're going to go after the bad cops here and there, just like we go after bad anything else. And it's a lot more critical when you have a bad cop, though, because cops have got guns and things happen, okay? But in the main, the support is almost unequivocal, and we support you. Please stay the course.
That's amazing. Mr. Kirsanow, I know you are a busy man, and I cannot tell you how much I appreciate you coming on today. Thank you so much, and I look forward to keeping in touch with you.
Thank you.